What's up, lore masters? Right before the war ended, the female changeling ordered the entire native population of Cardassia, and Cardassians everywhere, to be wiped from the universe. Hundreds of millions of Cardassians were killed before the Federation Alliance, along with the Cardassian military remnants that had joined them, could stop the atrocity. However, stop them they would when the Dominion ultimately surrendered and the war was over. Let's take a look at the day after. After the war, a treaty would be signed that included the United Federation of Planets, the Klingon Empire, the Romulan Star Empire, the Bajoran Republic, as well as the Cardassian Union and the founders of the Dominion. Ironically, in the actual treaty, it designates that the Romulan Star Empire and Klingon Empire are in the Alpha Quadrant when they clearly aren't, or at least a majority of their space is not. But that's neither here nor there, and I just point it out so that we can have the arguments in the comments. This treaty, also known as the Treaty of Bajor, would require the female changeling to surrender herself to the United Federation of Planets to stand trial for war crimes. Additionally, all Dominion military personnel were to commence a complete withdrawal from the Alpha Quadrant within 26 hours of the general ceasefire. I guess they could stay in the Beta Quadrant, or the Prophets would allow them to return without massacring everybody that entered into the wormhole, or maybe the Prophets would still massacre them and the Federation Alliance simply didn't care. We're never really told. Anyway, continuing on, all territories occupied by the Dominion would be returned to their respective sovereign powers, including the Cardassian Union and Breen Confederacy. And that any Dominion territory gained, including by treaty, must be ceded to the Alpha Quadrant. Just the quadrant itself, no specific power. The last requirement is perhaps the most controversial, though. It states that all borders, sovereignty, and ownership of affected territory would return to its pre-war status as of the point in time when the first Dominion fleet entered the Alpha Quadrant. This means that the Cardassian territory that the Klingons had captured during the Klingon-Cardassian War stayed with the Klingons. To be succinct here, the Klingon Empire would be rewarded for the titular conflict that all but guaranteed the Cardassians would join the Dominion. Maybe Gowron wasn't as idiotic as people make him seem. Basically, the Klingons were a major player in causing a multi-quadrant war, and then they get to keep the land that really started that war. I think the former Chancellor is onto something here. Along with some questionable choices, the treaty would highlight something that many don't really discuss. That is, that Bajor ultimately stays independent, at least for the moment. It would be recognized as the Bajoran Republic instead of the provisional government that we'd always heard it called before. Something definitely worth noting. Additionally, depending on how you read the treaty, this might be a return to the demilitarized zone, which means that any Maquis that survived the war, in theory, could start rebuilding. Not that they would, and to be honest, it's more likely that the DMZ stopped existing and those planets were now just firmly in the control of their respective nations. That could have also been the trade-off, where Cardassia gets to keep those planets with no Maquis, but had to cede the territory they lost to the Klingons, so maybe there was some negotiation. When you look at the layout of the Alpha and Beta Quadrants after the war, it's kind of interesting. One of the things that has been constantly highlighted by this war is that Romulans absolutely don't know how to effectively wage war. To be fair, this seems consistent, whether in an alternate universe or actual war in the Prime universe. When in actual combat, the tactics of the Romulans seem to include folding easy. While I'm aware that Sloane was worried about the Romulans being a large threat after the Dominion War was over, it is possible that he had not counted on the energy-dampening weapons which crippled the fleets of the Ryahansu and possibly led them to not being a larger threat as described by Odo. I might also wager that this war, along with Shinzon's insurrection, possibly crippled the Romulans to the point that they would need assistance with the evacuation of their planet, like we see in Star Trek Picard. Another interesting piece that I never really see anyone talk about is that we assume that Sloane was being completely honest. After all, the entire operation was meant to trick Bashir so that he would get a mole into the highest echelons of the Romulan leadership. So the Romulans may have never been a threat from what Starfleet could see. It was simply Sloane manipulating Bashir. The Klingon Empire would emerge completely different from what it had been when it entered into the war. At least a third of the Klingon fleet was destroyed before the war had begun, and another third or more had been annihilated during. The infrastructure was shaken up as Martok attained chancellorship, and things looked hopeful now that the known corruption of the Klingon Empire's internal affairs was coming to an end. However, the Empire would have to rebuild, and its feudal system would add additional challenges to restoring the Klingon defense force to its former glory. The Cardassians had always been somewhat of a developing nation within the galactic arena. It was because of this that the government was militaristic and expansionist. With hundreds of millions dead, the loss of territory, and the near destruction of their entire military, the Cardassians would be heavily reliant on trade and support from other Alpha and Beta Quadrant powers. While this isn't in canon, for the moment at least, it's likely that the Federation would supply the bulk of aid for Cardassia, which probably would lead to the entire government and peoples being absorbed into the Federation at the end of the day. We don't know much about the Breen or the impact of the war on their nation. From everything that's observed, the major loss for them was ships and people. They would keep their sovereign territory and infrastructure. In theory, their military would be curbed, but there's no evidence of this one way or the other. One of the major changes to occur is probably to one of the least talked about nations. That is the drastic political and infrastructural changes in the Ferengi alliance. The inner workings moving from a free marketplace to one that protects its citizenry is quite distinct. Most say, and the dialogue does support, that this is largely due to the machinations of Quark's mother, but I'd be willing to bet the treaty between the Ferengi Alliance and the Federation Alliance probably solidified these improvements. After all, the Ferengi would work more and more closely with Starfleet and the Federation and see all that type of attitude has to offer. Eddington wasn't wrong in the way the Federation assimilates other species after all. There would be other smaller nations that would enter into the war on one side or the other, one of these being the Sona. And while these peoples and nations were impacted, we don't know enough to really break down what happened to them, not in totality. The impact on the Dominion would be a mixed bag. The Alpha and Beta Quadrant forces would be battered, bruised, and demoralized, but the Gamma Quadrant forces would largely be untouched. The Gamma Quadrant had lost a massive fleet, true, but their entire infrastructure was intact. They had the ability to mass-produce ships, Forta and more Jem'Hadar. While the Founders were sick and dying, they would still be able to exert their will. Honestly, the fear of the female changeling always confused me. I'm not convinced that if the forces in the Gamma Quadrant ever decided to restart the war and could get through the wormhole, that they wouldn't win. It's probably a question we'll never see discussed in Star Trek Picard, I'm absolutely sure. The biggest winner, and something I honestly see reflected in Star Trek Picard on that note, would be the United Federation of Planets. When the war started, the mentality and production of the United Federation of Planets existed in a way that assumed no major wars would occur. However, after the first year of conflict and the loss of so much life and just having so much death, the Federation would have its entire infrastructure revamped, one that would be able to support a quote-unquote war economy. Hundreds of worlds began to create and produce weapons and ships of war to fight the Dominion. Vessels as old as the Miranda were retrofitted to better withstand the weaponry of the enemy, and everyone became a part of the solution. The capture of Beta Z, the massive losses of entire fleets would change the culture as well. Cadets would be fast-tracked into officer status, and those peacetime explorers who joined to look at the universe and discover new things were killed off and replaced by wartime officers trained to fight and kill the Dominion. A large part of the internal structure of Starfleet would be replaced by Warhawks, not because of any internal coup or because of a natural progression, but because the Dominion was killing everyone off. Section 31 would become stronger than ever. The Starfleet that left the Dominion War would be one naturally geared towards protection first, exploration second. With the exception of Section 31, in essence, the Starfleet post-Dominion War was quite like the Starfleet during the original series. While we can't be sure any new territories were gained by the Federation during the conflict, we do know that Starfleet came out the strongest, being able to now severely outmatch any other major Alpha and Beta Quadrant power. It's an irony that the Dominion wanted to change the geopolitical landscape of the Alpha and Beta Quadrants. It wanted everyone to be subjugated under them. Ironically, they would only ensure that the one government that wasn't arguably authoritarian would become the major stakeholder. Without argument, Starfleet would now be able to enact its will and heavily influence Quadrant events for a long time. There are very few instances in Trek history that a definable change or turning point can be seen, even an unintended one. The Dominion War would be one of these times. There would be no question that things had changed, that entire governments were now completely different, that they were shadows of their former selves. The Alpha and Beta Quadrants would never be the same the day after the Dominion War.
I don't think I'll die today or next week, but someday I'm going to have to get back out in the world and take my chances on it. I have high blood pressure and I'm 52 years old, so I probably wouldn't make it. So, yep, probably will.